On the 4th of March in 1942, Henry Charles Huddy, the man in this picture, enlisted in the Australian Army. Now, perhaps like many other naive young men from rural Australia, he was inspired by a sense of nationalism or captivated at the prospect of adventure abroad. But whatever the reason, Henry never made it overseas. In April 1943, he was struck by a car while crossing the road in North Sydney. As he attempted to get up, he was hit a second time. Henry died from lacerations to the brain at the age of 32. My grandmother therefore has only the vaguest recollections of her father. But a number of years ago, she was able to place a poppy beside the bronze embossed letters H.C. Huddy at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. My entire family, not just my grandmother, can take at least some comfort in the knowledge that his memory and his service have been honoured with dignity, despite his extremely undignified death. But I'm not here to talk to you about Henry Huddy. The story I want to share is the story of his widow, and her name was Thelma. Unlike her husband, whose name is preserved on one of his nation's great monuments, Thelma Huddy's name endures only in salacious tabloids, in soulless reports, in purloined letters. For 7 decades, her memory has been sequestered in government archives. On the 26th of February, 1944, less than a year after her husband was killed, Thelma's dead body was found floating in the Pine River in the far north of the city of Brisbane. It's unlikely we'll ever know with certainty what happened to her. In fact, when my grandmother was a child, she was told, if anyone ever asks you how your mother died, you just tell them she drowned, and that's all you tell them. And my grandmother assures me that in those days, children did exactly as they were told, and they did only as they were told. So for the majority of her life, and in the absence of any other explanation, my grandmother believed that Thelma accidentally drowned when she was 29. The available evidence, however, suggests otherwise, and only now can she accept the far more likely scenario that her mother was in fact murdered. In 2014, 70 years after Thelma died, I was studying at university to be a journalist. And I remember walking into my supervisor's office and telling him that my final submission would be an account of the life and death of my great-grandmother. I can't say that he was optimistic. Few people were alive who knew Thelma. The historical records were incomplete, and the troubling circumstances surrounding her death were such that people may have been unwilling to speak on the record. But this wasn't a history assignment, and my objective was not to revive an already public narrative. I wanted to give everyone in my family the opportunity to bring her story to life, to understand her character, and to connect with Thelma in a personal way for the very first time. I wanted to break the silence. And so, I spent 8 months researching Brisbane's history, collecting photographs, studying maps, interviewing family members who I never knew existed, and poring over newspapers on microfilm until my eyes burned. I would spend entire weekends in the State Archive office, trawling through piles and piles of coronial inquest and murder files, trying to make the pieces fit, trying to find that one revealing parallel that might help to demystify what happened to Thelma. One of the earliest discoveries I made was that the circumstances of Thelma's death were anything but unique. Her case was eerily similar to those of many other young women killed in Brisbane in the 1940s. Laura Mowat, Eileen Perkins, Phyllis Cudbird, Gwenda Tatham, Patricia Robinson, Esther Hetherington. These victims shared at least one thing in common. They were all pregnant. And in the hours or days leading up to their deaths, they had all sought to terminate their pregnancies. As they spent their final hours in hospital, dying of septic abortion, they were steadfast in their misguided loyalty, unwilling to reveal the names of those who had operated on them. And as a result, few abortionists were ever apprehended. What we know from autopsy reports. These operations were crudely performed by inexperienced people with dangerous implements and chemicals. In Thelma's case, however, it was a little bit different. There was no sign of any illegal interference. In other words, no operation had been performed. But what I can tell you with near certainty is that in the 24 hours before she died, she was desperately trying to make contact with an abortionist or someone working as a kind of agent. So, how was it that she, or any of these other young women, for that matter, came to find themselves in this horrific situation? I think that to understand the answer, it's important to paint a picture of the city of Brisbane in the 1940s. This was a city fundamentally transformed by the war. As an important base for American forces during the campaign in the Pacific, there were some 80,000 American servicemen stationed in Brisbane at the peak of the war. And with them, they brought the glamour and excitement of American culture, which until that time, the Australian youth had only ever seen in the movies. So all of a sudden, Camel cigarettes, milkshakes, jitterbugging, Coca-Cola were all very much a part of the city's cultural scene. And the Americans, what with their white teeth and uniforms as handsome as their salaries, were irresistible to the Australian women. In the months following Henry's death, Thelma moved to Brisbane to stay with his family. And it was there that she met Corporal Davidson, a 25-year-old in the US Army from Louisiana. And romance quickly blossomed between the two. Davidson was a young man living it up in a city bustling with activity, and Thelma, slowly coming to terms with her husband's death, was clearly thrilled to once again be the object of a man's adoration. But things began to unravel when Thelma accidentally fell pregnant with Davidson's child. In a letter to him, she wrote, "In 2 weeks it will all be over. 11 o'clock on the 25th. It will take only 30 minutes, they told me. You are quite safe. No one else knows. That's gospel." For a young woman from a small country town, the prospect of scandal was infinitely more terrifying than flirting with the sleazy underworld of a big city. But then again, I don't believe she had any idea of the danger into which she put herself. Abortion may not have been spoken about, but it was commonplace. And in fact, one Australian journalist recently estimated that as many as 1 in 4 pregnancies at the time were terminated. On the 25th of February, she met with the owner of a contraceptive store in the city centre, a woman by the name of Nance Wiles. And immediately after that encounter, Thelma proceeded to the bank and withdrew £15. And this was in addition to the £60 already on her person. That was the equivalent of about half the annual salary she was earning as a seamstress. And by the following day, she was dead. Nance Wiles subsequently denied providing Thelma with any advice regarding obtaining an operation. And I find that very, very difficult to accept as true. If Thelma did meet with an abortionist later that day, it's possible that she was administered an anaesthetic that caused her to go into shock, perhaps over-inhalation of chloroform. Her money could have then been stolen and her body disposed of in the river. But this is purely my speculation, and in any case it leaves a number of loose ends unaccounted for. But at the end of the inquest, the coroner was able to make only one definitive conclusion, and he said, "I hold the definite opinion that the deceased did not commit suicide." And after 8 months spent researching Thelma's life, I can comfortably share that conclusion. You see, Thelma's own mother died at 26, leaving her and her sister to be raised by a sadistic stepmother who liked to punish them by forcibly holding them underwater or putting them on the hot stovetop. And I'm told that Thelma used to say that she would have done anything to protect her own children from experiencing the sort of cruelty and abuse that she had endured as a child. And the very painful irony in what happened to Thelma was that her own mother's premature death was a result of an abortion, self-inflicted with a knitting needle. Throughout this investigation, I collected and transcribed hours and hours of recorded interviews, people telling me what they remembered about Thelma and how their lives changed as a result of what happened to her. And what I discovered as I collected these first-hand accounts was the profound ways in which these memories coalesced to recover the unknown, the unheard, and the forgotten. I was under no illusions that discussing this topic widely and openly would make a lot of people in my family very, very uncomfortable. And it's true, sometimes it's better just to let sleeping dogs lie. But I also foresaw that giving the opportunity to honour Thelma's memory could actually be a cathartic experience for those who suffered, either directly or indirectly, as a result of what happened to her. Oral accounts of history offer a powerful vehicle for journalists to convey stories that are more vivid, more heartrending, and more human. But more importantly than that, these oral history narratives connect people from different generations and social classes to one another, allowing them to find solace in the knowledge that memories of traumatic experiences and complex feelings are shared. Those experiences could be experiences of abuse or terrorism, political oppression, but allowing subjects the opportunity to tell their story on their own terms, openly and honestly, actually helps them feel more comfortable to tell it. The Belarusian journalist Svetlana Alexievich actually uses oral history in an effort to repair her country's broken sense of community, to bring to light the hidden stories and suppressed emotions of the Soviet era. Her style of journalism empowers ordinary people to connect through a sense of shared humanity in the face of terror and disaster. And to build her evocative account of the aftermath of Chernobyl, Alexievich collected stories from more than 1,000 people. I wouldn't want to suggest that what I've undertaken is anywhere near as ambitious as that, but I firmly believe in the limitless potential of storytelling to bring people together, and to allow for rich connections that help us to make sense of complicated, even epoch-making phenomena. And I would even go so far as to say that in our post-truth world, journalism can and should be enriched by the multivocal nature of oral history. As we negotiate the fluidity of memory, as we confront contradictions, and as we contemplate voices from the margins, we are forced to relentlessly question our concept of what is true. Around this time, I exchanged emails with a journalist in Sydney who had produced an award-winning radio documentary about her own grandmother's death from a backyard abortion in 1942. And like Thelma, the scandal surrounding Edna Haynes' death had virtually erased her from memory. And in fact, this journalist had spent most of her life believing that her grandmother's death was a result of acute food poisoning. How many of these stories, of the presumably hundreds of women and girls killed as a result of trying to end their pregnancies, will simply remain untold? And more to the point, why should we allow the puritanical attitudes of a bygone era influence, or rather continue to influence, the memories that we hold and cherish? I never wanted to paint my great-grandmother as a tragic figure. Given the way she died and the months of publicity that followed, it's inevitable, I think, that she will always be defined by what happened to her in 1944. But her letters revealed a woman who was charming and witty and an adoring mother. And those who remembered her described her in much the same way. She was vibrant, she was optimistic. I'm told that after she saw Holiday Inn at the cinema, she had the song White Christmas stuck in her head, and she used to sing it incessantly. She was gregarious, she was something of a social butterfly, and one person could only remember that she always wore a necklace with a sparkly crystal pendant. Through these admittedly very small fragments of memory, an impression of Thelma finally begins to emerge, and one that allows us to remember her as a real person, as opposed to a grainy photograph in a newspaper clipping. My great aunt told me that all she'd ever wanted her entire life was to know that her parents loved her. She was shattered at the thought that her mother might have committed suicide. And I was able to show her this letter. And in this letter, Thelma writes to her friends and tells them of how she wept when her daughters returned to boarding school after the holidays. And even though she sent them with new toys and freshly baked sweets, she just couldn't help it. She was a big sook. It might not have been enough to assuage a lifetime of pain and confusion, but in that moment, a burden certainly lifted. Davidson passed away in 1983. And of course, I was curious to know the sort of man he was, how his life changed after the war, and whether he ever mentioned Thelma. After many weeks of research, and with a lot of help from Google, I managed to track down Davidson's son. My decision to contact him was made especially difficult by the fact that he is a Baptist minister based in Texas. He claimed to have never heard of Thelma. He claimed to have known virtually nothing of his father's war service. And when he emailed me back asking me what I knew of the exact nature of the friendship between his father and my great-grandmother, I decided to share with him the facts of the case as I understood them. And despite a few very gentle attempts to follow up, I never heard back from him. For what it's worth, my impression of Davidson is formed not from any historical document, but from the memory of a 6-year-old. My great-aunt actually remembers walking by his side as a small child, and she burst into tears because she suddenly realized that her brand new white shoes had been splattered with mud. Davidson pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiped her shoes clean, and through his syrupy grin, gave her a big wink. I'm somewhat saddened that I wasn't able to build that connection with Davidson's son. And maybe one day that might change. And I hope it does, because I think there is still a lot that we can share. And if there's one more thing I want to share with him, just one more thing, it's that story of a little girl during the war who to this day can still remember his father's smile. Thank you.